Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or morning, as some of you may be. I'm Jane Combs, the co-coordinator of the Emerging Centers call track for CARC People Network. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Scott Yockel from Harvard University, the University Research Computing Officer, who has a broad experience with all different ways of running high performance computing centers, and knows some good and some bad and some ugly, so about all of those. This has been a conversation that the Emerging Centers community is very interested in, as a lot of us are developing our business processes. Some are being able to develop them on their own. Others are being told what we're going to do. So it's nice to have input and feedback from others that have experience, that have been able to learn the lessons and maybe be able to give us some of those words that we can share with our leadership and with our community as we develop ours. So with that, I think what we'll do is Scott has a few slides to share and some conversation, and then we will, I think you can take questions during your presentation. Is that okay? So we'll be monitoring the chat and kind of pop up if anybody has questions. Go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to watch and get your questions to Scott. And then afterwards, we can have hopefully a pretty good discussion on different items as we go forward. This is only 1 hour. We talked about, I think this will be a nice introduction to this conversation, which we've had this conversation in previous calls, but probably again in February or March, we'll address this again, and maybe we'll be able to get some of Scott's time again to be part of a panel. Okay, go ahead, Scott. It's all yours.
Sure. So nice to meet you all. I recognize some of the names on the call, and some will be new faces for me. Just wanted to give 2 pieces of information about myself. I've been in your shoes before. I was at University of North Texas, is where I started out managing high performance computing. That was a group, North Texas, not a large research institution, a very large teaching school, like 36,000 students. Managed high performance computing there as a group of 3 of us. I was also a graduate student there when there was not a high performance computing, and it was like a hodgepodge of things that one person in a Unix group helped faculty kind of combine things together to kind of look like an HPC system. That's what I did a lot of my research space in. And then I've gone from that extreme, I feel like, to the extreme of when I've come to Harvard, in a place where there is a lot of resources, but resources are always tight across. So Harvard is a very rich institution, but somehow within every department it feels not rich, which is a really bizarre situation that you find yourself in. But I know the extremes of both, and what I will talk about today are things that I've learned at Harvard from thinking about how to construct cost. It's really important, whether you're a cost center or not, that you really understand how to measure cost. And it doesn't have to be difficult. I hope that's what you glean from today's thing. And you can make some pretty crude approximations, but it at least starts to make you understand what is the cost of your service. I'm by no means an expert, but I have learned a bit from trying to do some of this with research administration over the last 5 years. So hopefully I can, share some of those learnings with you today. And I have about 15 slides, so not a long presentation, and probably best in each kind of place of like, let me get through the whole single slide, and then you can ask questions about that slide. We can also just do lots of discussion at the end, so there'll be plenty of time for discussion. So let me get started. All right, so you should be seeing the full screen and not my notes. Okay. I've also given this talk a few different times, and I've tried to make it as generic as possible at this point, instead of talking specifically about what happened at Harvard, but I do kind of point to that at the end. So cost models in the universities, they're basically kind of 2 different top-level ways to pay for things, right? You either pay for them out of what's called facilities and administration overhead, or sometimes used to be referred to as indirect cost. The purpose of F&A, which I'll most of the time refer to it as, is that it supports common infrastructure for research, right? So it should be something that's ubiquitous to everyone. All the cost, like I've written out here, all the costs for all the research services are essentially summed out and spread out over all the grants. You can think of it as a tax, right? Every different institution comes up with what that is. A huge part of what goes into that on the facility side is the amount of square footage that's part of the research space. So every graduate student that's operating in a lab is taking up, and that lab takes up square footage. They're not charged rent for that square footage, right? The PI isn't in that sense because it comes off the top as a part of this tax. So what are all the other services at your university that operate in this space? Think about that as you think about it. So like a lot of the library services, a lot of the other things like that. When it comes to fee for service, that would be individuals who are consuming the service are paying for their specific need. So that service is not ubiquitous. It's something that's unique to a set of researchers. Maybe you have a sequencing facility, right? That's probably going to be set up as a fee for service because it does not even benefit the whole of science, right? If you were in a science school, as opposed to, something that might benefit everyone, like a software contract for MATLAB. Might be that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it's just paid for by the university as a part of like F&A. The service in the fee for service has to be quantifiable. The cost must be fair and equitable in order to be compliant. And I'll kind of touch on that today. So some of the things that you must realize in the service cost to be fair and equitable, it means that you cannot give away the service for free for one instance and then turn around and charge it. So as a charge in some other case. So you can't give storage away for free and also charge for it. That was one of the pretty obvious things, but I think a lot of us think about that, like, yeah, we'll give you some starter amount and then we'll give you, then we'll charge you for the rest. You can't really do that as a fee for service in what would be a traditional academic cost recovery center. So all the costs have to be incorporated into like an annual cost per the service unit. And so we'll spend a lot of time today talking about what that looks like. So as an example for storage, that might be $1 per terabyte per year, or if it was a sequencing, the $1 per de novo sequencing run, that kind of thing. So in an instrument, you might include all of the, chemicals, all the other aspects of running the service, the FT costs, all that. But you probably are not charging them power and rent because that portion of it would be covered in F&A, as an example. So we also find ourselves in this really interesting mix that I don't think exists in the instrument space very often, is this condo model, right? Where the equipment is actually purchased by a PI because they're not charged overhead for it. They're not charged F&A overhead for CapEx equipment, but it's managed by a central group because that just makes a logical sense for numerous reasons. So in that, really, your condo model is your service is more of a hosted service. Like your hosting equipment, that would be the service. And if you wanted to charge them, space, power, and cooling, you could. That would have to be fee for service, or not. That would be F&A, right? So cost models in universities. Let's talk about those two and my view of the pros and cons. Definitely not the rule for everyone, but this is what I feel like I've learned over the years. When you think about an F&A, it's on the administrative side, there's an overhead to it, and that administrative effort goes to the grants office. That's a pro because it's really streamlined and straightforward. It just, every time they spend $1, a certain amount of that comes off of F&A, goes into a pool. You have a large pool of funds. But what's challenging about that is there's less, one of the pros of that is in F&A, there's not very much fluctuation in the income that comes in. It's just like, like a tax from a government. Like they have a pretty solid income that comes in from that every year. It's much more predictable. A con from that, so that's what my pluses and minuses are, would be that, I don't know, but I've never been in an institution, I never talked to anybody in an institution that actually could tell you, I feel like it's the most secretive part of universities is how's the F&A split up? Who gets what percentage of it? Does that percent ever go back to research computing? And any kind of related way that if the F&A income increased, is research computing, who is now supporting more research, getting an increase or a decrease if that happened? That part's really hard. So that's hard to build a model around, right? So that may then lead to this lack of growth of infrastructure or staff to meet the demand. So if the research demand goes up, but your F&A is not recharging your income, there's a problem there. So the other aspect is in F&A, because it's ubiquitous, are you beholden the ideas of like, should I redistribute the resources evenly? Like, should everybody get resources distributed out evenly? And then is this model sustainable? So I don't know, to be honest. So we flip and think about fee for service, and I think my last line is getting cut off on the slides here, but in a fee for service, you're taking on in the fee for service space the administrative burden. You now have to bill faculty directly instead of it happening the other way around. There's less flexibility in that sense because the funds for your service are then now tied to that service. So I can take my storage funds and then use them for HPC or vice versa. So you really are concretely defining from a financial standpoint, like that service as its own. But you do have a separate budget for that service, which means that services can, their budget normally is a multi-year kind of thing. It can go in the red and the black back and forth, and then over time, it has to be averaged out. So it's the way that a nonprofit operates is the same kind of idea, the way in which your service. So there is some flexibility in the budget in that sense. And then you do have complete control of the way in which you build the cost to have, as you add more staff and you add more infrastructure, you are increasing the cost of your service, but you also have a means to pay for it. So there is that positive. But then there is the negative part of that is like, did you just now take your hardline staff that were funded through F&A and then just turn them into soft funded people? I think that's a part that you have to be really cautious of, that the administration is not doing that to you. And so then the one thing that is missing on the bottom of this that got cut off is sustainability. So is the fee for service model sustainable? I mean, that was the whole purpose of why you would go down that route, is to make it more sustainable, to get rid of this problem of lack of growth of infrastructure and staff. So both, I think the ultimate goal of creating costs is to make something sustainable. Okay, so I'll pause for a second and see if we have any questions about the kind of F&A versus fee for service as a top level construct. I see the note in the chat. Do we have a default can we have a default allocation with dollar for going over that is just a feature of your fee structure? So, Rich, yes, you can. Well, in the research administration rules, right, that the feds give them, and they are very good about making sure you stay in the bounds of, is that you can only charge in your fee for service actual annual costs. So you can't overcharge for a service and build up a surplus, which is different than I think the way in which an IT administrative unit does for their services, because they're not beholden to what our federal regulations around what an academic service center can be. So there's kind of, so there's that aspect of it. You can't charge, but you can get close to that, I should say that way. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and talk then about how do we construct cost? Yep.
Hey, did you see, I think that Rich's conversation started from Jaime a little bit further up, said, why can one give a fixed amount of storage by default and charge some PIs for any additional storage they need, the default?
Oh, yeah, I missed the part of it.
That's okay.
You can, if you're creating what is formerly known as an academic service center, you cannot charge different rates to different people because the cost has to be the same no matter who you are on campus. And so that's why you cannot give away part of it for free and then also charge for it. But it also doesn't mean that you have to define all of your services the same. So as an example, let me go back. In this fee for service space, you can construct a high performance computing service that does not have, say, like long-term project storage. Like you can have home directories, you can have Scratch, you can have some starter amount of storage. You're defining that as the high performance computing service, which is different than this project storage service. It is very challenging to educate your research administration office about the difference, and not all storage is the same. I had to go through that, and that's how we got around it, is that we defined a storage that was a part of high performance computing as completely a separate service than storage that is more long-term. So I think I wrote a little like one pager at one point. I mean, I know I did, but I don't know if I still have it, but I wrote a one pager at one point to explain the differences, like physically in an office, like you have a desktop and you have in your desk, or in your desktop, you have a drawer. And these are the things that you're working on now, which is very different than going down the hall to the file room or going off site to like a storage facility where longer term storage of files is kept. So you have to really be cognizant of their trying to follow the rules that they're beholden to on research administration, right? That are handed to them. And then you have to kind of need to interpret that and make sure that you explain to them the difference. And so we no longer at Harvard use the term storage, we call them folders. So they get a Scratch folder, they get a home directory folder, and they get a project or a lab folder, but that's part of HPC. And storage is what we call the things in the storage service center. So hope that helps in that conversation, because that took me at least a year of like, meetings about every month or two to explain. So cost basis. So you have to have a formula that you create costs. So you have to have $1 per service unit. The formula and the way in which you construct the formula should never change for that service center. The individual cost of these things will change, and you'll update that on an annual basis. But you should not be monkeying around with how you're constructing the cost from the cost basis, especially in academic service. So let's talk about the components of this, and then I'll dive deep into each of these. So on the equipment, you have options. You can purchase things, you could lease things. On the facility side, in the data center, most of the time we're talking about space, power, and cooling as our costs. And then on the facilitation side, on the personnel side, you have personnel that do facilitation, that do development, that do systems. And then when you talk about the denominator, it's about the availability of these service units that you need to think about, not the total. So we're going to dive deep into each one of these, and then feel free after each one of these, if you want to stop and talk about these particular ones, we can dive into these. And then, so why would you choose a lease? One thing that's nice is a lease creates an annual cost automatically. There also is a finance charge, and then there is a little bit of contract overhead to be aware of. Like it has to go through legal in a way that when you purchase, normally you don't have to go through legal to make a purchase. There is an advantage that's not listed here to a lease, is it locks you in, meaning they can't take it out of your budget because the university is now signed up for 5 years of doing this, or whatever you decide the terms to be. So that's another thing. If you purchase, you do have to do asset tracking and depreciation tracking. That means back to your unit, back to your finance part. And at Harvard, I wasn't able to do that. The depreciated tracking would go into the college, but it couldn't get it all the way back into my department, into the fund that was the service center on the asset and on that depreciated tracking. So we went with annual costs for leasing, just as an example. Both of these, if you want to do this, you would do it at you'd make these decisions at a service level, right? So you can lease, say, HPC and decide to purchase storage and create two different services out of those. And so you're not beholden to one across the board, you're just deciding on each service. So yeah, any questions about that part. Okay,
I have a
because I know we
question.
go.
Yeah, I just have a quick question on that. So what if your equipment costs were grant funded? If your equipment was given by a grant?
Yeah, so then this equipment cost would just be zero. So,
And
and I'll show this later in some real like spreadsheets.
okay,
So,
okay.
yeah. Because that gets into the kind of condo model idea. Okay, on the facilities cost, space, power, and cooling, you have lots and lots of options in this space to decide on costs. You can look at space as a per U, like, or per rack. You can look at power. You can do per outlet. You could meter it. You could just look at the whole rack. You could look at averages per month. You could even be as crude as saying, this is storage. It's going to use 25% of its max power all the time because it doesn't really change a lot. You could just be that crude, and that's fine because what you're doing is being fair and equitable to everyone for the way in which you're constructing that cost. And if you were asked at some point and audited, well, show me that, you would want to be able to be close to that justification. So you may need to go into looking at the outlet for that or that machine, or just log into it and use the, you know, like on the Dell side, you'd use like your iDirect commands, and you could see how much power draw it was having. And you could just take that instantaneous amount and say that, well, we looked at it at this particular time and it was this percentage, and that's what we just decided to do. So you have a lot of flexibility, but you just have to do it the same way the rest of the year. And then same thing on cooling. Cooling a lot of times in a data center is charged along with power. It's most of the time used as a power, like there's a factor above the power that they charge for cooling because it costs electricity equivalent to the amount of power that you're consuming to cool the equipment. If you get a bill, you could just decide to evenly distribute across the racks. Just to give an example, in 2 different data centers we operate in one place I do it as a power factor because the Faculty of Arts and Sciences is a subtenant of the medical school, and that's the way in which they do it. And in another place in MGHPCC, it's evenly distributed across the number of racks. It's just more straightforward because we have a total charge for it. So those are the types of things that I would implore you to most of the time take the path down the right and not the left. Make it straightforward and easy. Really think about what comes on your bill if you're in a data center that bills you, or what does your university have information wise, and try to make it simple. So if you're building high performance computing, think about a whole rack unit at a time, or storage, think about a rack of that. And what does that consume? Are you able to get a bill for it for the month? Then just take that average and average that out, for that's the whole amount that you get for the year, you know, and be cognizant of, is there something particular that happened in this month that I don't want to use that month as the time that I measured? So you don't have to be exact, like you don't have to meter the power exactly, but you do have to have a method that you stick with and justify that you chose in order to come up with how you distribute these costs. I also would say don't try your best not to think about spaces per U, because the problem is you have a lot of non-used space. How are you going to allocate non-used per U space in that rack to the equipment in that rack, or to that particular service, especially if you end up mixing services like high performance computing and storage, like maybe your Lustre file system or something happens to be in the same rack and stuff. So think about things at a much gross level and assign them into that methodology. And I think that's a lot easier to explain. It's a lot easier to measure. It's much more equivalent to what you see on bills if you're in a data center. So all right, so I'll move on to the personnel part. So on personnel, you're thinking about like all the personnel that's involved in your service. So if you're thinking about high performance computing, you have systems folks that deploy it and manage it, help software, end user software, get compiled in the system, run the scheduler and all that. You may have facilitation folks who are, or hopefully you do, that are providing, you know, the service delivery and user services and stuff like that. So how do you want to construct costs based upon these? Would you just think of HPC only as the systems people and then separately have a cost that is facilitation? You know, you can definitely do that, or you can decide to bake, you know, all or a portion of that facilitation into the cost of the service. So don't forget, you're not including only the salary, you also need to include the benefits to be fully, you know, to have the full scope of that from your budget. On the system side, you have lots of things that go into a service. So for example, high performance computing, obviously you have compute, but there's probably some amount of storage that you have, like home directories and Scratch. You may have virtual machines that run the various different, you know, maybe you're running like Grafana and some other dashboards where you're collecting metrics. Maybe you're running VMs for your code management for the whole system. You know, there's lots of different things that you're actually pulling into running the service. And obviously it has networking involved. So you want to think about, what all of this do I want to include? Do I need to include all of it? Is there, or do I want to just say like a portion of this is just a part of doing business as research computing and we're not going to include in the service because it just becomes not worth it financially to track it, you know? And so like if 90% of your costs are compute and storage, why track the small amount that is virtual machine that you would have to divide up across like all your services, as an example. When you have development, when you're thinking about, perhaps you have research software engineering, but also they have to do work on systems as well. Like systems people need to support what's happening on the development side. And other things to think about is that on the facilitation, you can think about how do you want to think about their time? Are you really going to say like, well, this many tickets, this many office hours, and this much training, like these are the things that they're doing. Do we want to track them in that method? Do we want to have them add time to tickets? And so that's the total amount of time. I don't think your staff will like that very much. So I think you can come up with an approach maybe that's at a higher level, like how much of their time every year do they spend on what services? You know, things like that, that you can have them, or have them fill that out on a, you know, a percentage of effort do they think they're spending on this service per week or per month, would be a much easier way to measure it. So, you know, really think about, you know, you could be really as a gross estimate and say, I'm going to divide up my FTEs evenly across services and say, you know, these three staff do HPC, this one person does storage, and you have one person that takes care of virtual machines, like whatever you want to come up with. So, yeah, but probably don't want to do time tracking. Most people will not enjoy that. And also think about the availability of your service units. So when you construct service units, it would be easy to say, I have this many cores in my system times 24 hours times 365. Well, that would be assuming that you're up 100% of the time, all the time, and all of those service units are available. And that's just not realistic if you're going to do maintenance and stuff. So subtract out if you have like a monthly maintenance schedule, those are obviously not available during that time. The other thing is that most institutions, you're never at 100% utilization on your cluster. There are actual structural problems that happen. You can't get all of the various different combinations of amount of cores and memories to always come out evenly. So if you look over, you know, say a year period of time, maybe you're only at 85% utilization on average. So that's really the amount of service units that are available. So by decreasing the amount of service units from the total, you're then, you know, increasing this, the quotient here, the dollar amount. So that's an important part to understand. And you do the same thing on storage. You don't always use 100% of your storage because that's a problem. You'll break storage. It needs places on the back end to move data around. So those units are not available. So be cognizant of those. Okay, so I have two more slides. So what did we choose? And what is, you know, this is what Faculty of Arts and Sciences chose, which is a particularly different, I think, space than some, because at Harvard, there are 3 different F&A rates, because Harvard shows up as 3 different FIDs with the federal government. So the main campus, the Cambridge campus, where Faculty of Arts and Sciences is, versus the public health campus versus the medical and dental school campus. So we decided, because compute is transient, meaning I go and run a computation and then I release a resource and somebody else can come and use the same resource. That it's really straightforward that those servers can be shared. It's also very straightforward through things like XDMod to track, data coming off of Slurm into XDMod. It's easy to build out tracking at a high level. So what we do is cost recovery by school, because if you look at the way F&A comes into the institution, it comes in by school. And so the Faculty of Arts and Sciences is fronting the bill for running the HPC service, and then the model is to then redistribute those costs across the schools. So this is not an academic service center, right? This is F&A, but the difference is more than the Faculty of Arts and Sciences F&A comes into effect in order to provide the service across the school. So hopefully I've made that clear. The difference is on the data storage side. Data is normally perpetual. They put that on a physical server. Nobody else can use that space unless they were to delete their data, and that's just not what happens. So you can't really share that actual logical space. Of course, you can share like a large cluster, but I'm talking about like the space that occupies for that lab. And also the needs across disciplines, or even within some of the, especially like within life sciences, are wildly different. We have individual faculty who need petabytes, whereas 2 terabytes for maybe 100 individual labs is totally sufficient. So they made the decision to pull out the cost that was projected to be a part of the service out of the F&A. So that's what you have to do first in order to then transition it to a service center. So that part is really, really important. And then a couple other minor things, just to think about what's easy to measure. I kind of already touched on some of this. The HPC is leased. It's too large for a single purchase year. It's hard to like go and ask for those types of funds. And it's also doing that is not predictable on what kind of large scale funds is available. So leasing is straightforward. We do CPU hours per PI group. I just mentioned that with Slurm and XDMod. You can build a hierarchy to do that like per school. And then, yeah, so I kind of touched on all of this already. On the facility side, space, power, and cooling comes in as a single charge. And so it's just allocated to all racks evenly. The power is actually metered at the per rack, so it's really easy to just assign racks to different services and look at those. And then on the team side, on the FTE side, we do this where there's a lot of overlap between what people are doing is what services they're providing support for. So we just do a thing where they fill out every year the percent time they use on each. So that allows there to be a total number of hours that can be available for each service, and then you just compute that average of the FTE cost per hour of each service. So and then here's some really close, this is the last part, there's a really close to what is the actual, but it's not, I can't show you the real numbers, but so what am I computing? There's a home directory space, there's a scratch space, and these are annualized costs, right? There's high performance computing, there's FTE costs, and here you can just see we're splitting FTE costs between the equipment that is provided by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences versus equipment that's provided by faculty, right? So we're just saying like half the cluster is funded in this way, the other half of the condo model is funded that way. There's a certain number of racks, and it's half and half in the sense that this is the personnel time, not half and half as far as the number of racks. And so you get a subtotal, and then you have the number of cores that are available, and then you come up with the amount of CPU hours that are available per year. And this takes into account that there are maintenance and other things, and you come up with then dividing the total by the number of hours, and you come up with your per hour. And so you can see the differences is when they provide the equipment, you can see the cost is much lower because that's a huge chunk of the cost, but it's not insignificant. And so what happens here is this is kind of like if you compare to Amazon, this would be kind of your on demand, and this would be like your spot instance. So that's kind of what you're comparing the two different things to. Because on the spot instance space, I should also mention a lot of universities, like we do at Harvard, when the faculty who provided the equipment are not using it, it's available on a backfill that anybody else can use it. And then there's a preemption that happens, like it would if you were in a spot instance, that then kicks your job off and finds, another open space. So that's how that's done. And I think, yeah, so these are just some of the estimates that I just talked about. And then on the storage side, you could decide to do this however you want. I'm just trying to show you that there's a lot of things to take into consideration, and I'm doing it at a whole rack level. I did something really crude and said, 75% of the max power is what is consumed. Don't forget that coming up with a usable amount of terabytes is a really important thing. You have RAID, which you lose a lot, and then you also need a max percentage that you're actually going to operate at. You're not going to go over that, or you start causing file system corruption problems. And also you're able to break out things like the hardware costs versus software costs. So if you're using something like Isilon, there's actually software costs involved in that as licensing for the file system or GPFS or whatever else you're choosing. And you can construct this as like their total time, or you can do something crude like this, where I was like, how much does it take to set up the service? How much maintenance do we need per year for the service? And we're thinking about just the whole rack. So you're coming up with a very kind of similar cost structure. You have space, power, cooling, and then facilities cost, and then you have the FTE cost. So you get your analyzed cost, and then you have your terabytes, and you get terabytes per year. And then this overhead I always keep track of is like, what is the overhead above the CapEx that is what is in the cost? Because that gets asked all the time. Yeah, so that's it. I don't want to take a bit more time at this point. So lots of good questions. So just to hit on a couple of these, I see like Tim asked, like, who pays for storage that's unused? So over time, you can build that into your cost model, right? So this is like, you have to make some crude estimates at the beginning. I think the goal for charging for storage was really to have money to buy equipment in the future. So that could continue to happen. It was never meant to be like total cost recovery. But if you're trying to do a much closer part to cost recovery over the life of equipment, you would understand what percentage of that utilization happens. And then the next time you deploy, say the next 3 or 4 years down the road, you could add that into your cost model. You could say that it turns out, even though we have, say, like 100 terabytes available, the first 2 years only 25 or 30% of that gets used. Thus, in order to not sink the cost of that, we would then charge that into the service cost. But I think the one thing to think is, like, when you're creating service costs that faculty are really going to pay for it, you need to create costs that, one, they can pay for. So it has to be attractive, and it has to be a high quality service. So you're not going to charge them more than what they would just go out and buy and throw in their lab, because then that defeats the purpose. So there's part of that you have to really think about. And then so in Harvard, the high performance computing at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences is part of F&A. So that's not charged to faculty directly. That's distributed across this at the school level of which schools are consuming that service. And each school has it built into their F&A. The storage is charged directly to faculty, but only in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. The medical school has all of their services currently in as a part of their F&A. So let me stop my screen share. So what other questions have people had? So in Sanos, how do you decide how much to charge each school? Well, that's the consumption of, on the HPC side, that's the consumption of, so each of the, so we have the concept that a PI is kind of like the top, or I should say the PI is the aggregate, like the lab is the aggregate by which all utilization, access control, and all of that kind of stuff happens. And so all HPC utilization, all storage utilization, all that is rolled up to a PI. And then those PIs are then designated as a school at a particular school, right? There are very few that are actually administratively housed out of multiple schools. They may have teaching appointments and do a lot of that kind of stuff, but when it comes to the administrative side, they're normally housed out of one unit. And so we follow that rubric. And so whatever their faculty use quarterly gets rolled up and a report is given to them. And then that's how they're billed. And so there's different cost strings in FAS, like for CPU versus GPU versus equipment that is provided by faculty, right? So there's kind of three different costs within the HPC. Those are different offerings, like if you're using like kind of the ITIL framework, those are different offerings of the same service. So that answer your question, Stratus? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Scott.
Yeah, and so part of the purpose of that was that as the Faculty of Arts and Sciences grew and joined MJHPCC and like the cluster really grew, other parts of the university realized they didn't need to maintain like on-campus 2 and 3 racks of smaller HPC, like School of Engineering ran one for the climate groups. And so but the sciences shouldn't be the one that's fronting the bill for the whole of the university. So this was a way to redistribute costs. So if you were operating, say, research computing out of a central administrative unit, like the CIO's office or VPR's office, that might be a way in which you think about spreading the cost. But if the finances are such that the F&A comes directly to the research VP's office, they take off the portion for research computing and then distribute to the schools, then you don't have to do that. But if it's the opposite, that it gets distributed to schools and central admin has very little control over those funds, you need a way to like recoup cost accordingly. And then also may make you decide how to give out resources differently. You may not give them out equally. You know, like you can always decide that too.
I think there was a question from Gregory further up the chat. Scott, did you catch that already?
What would be the argument for leasing of on-prem HPC hardware rather than using commercial cloud? It's, I think, kind of, if I had to make it really simple, it's kind of, there's a control element to it, and there's also a cost element to it. Do you want to control everything about how it's operated and know everything about how it's operated? Like, you want to understand everything from how the networking and the IO performance and disk. So you don't necessarily have that full insight when you're in the cloud. You can get quite a bit. Then there's a cost difference. Can you operate it more efficiently on campus than you can in the cloud? That's really dependent upon where you are and your economies of scale and your pressures on you know, how fast you can deliver something and all that. So leasing is more of a financial model for on-prem, mostly around, I mean, in my experience, like what's easier for your institution. I know when I was at a small institution, I was glad to have the lease because my CapEx money would not get taken from me and used for some other purpose. I didn't have to worry about it. We leased equipment. We knew we'd have it, you know. It also was easier to come in and ask for 1/5 of the money, you know, if I'm going to lease over 5 years, than ask for 5 times that. So those are some lessons that I've learned. How do you account for GPU usage? This is what Vinod is asking. That has thousands of tiny cores. So you're really, like, every time you're talking about usage, you're talking about what a researcher is blocking others from using and then I equate that to like the financial amount of that resource. So on GPUs, we didn't in the past have a mechanism to say what percentage of the GPUs are they using off of the server. It was also common that most people would use all of the GPUs on a server. It was very uncommon that they would use a fraction. It wasn't common that they were using GPUs across multiple servers. So we just use the amount of memory and CPU utilization as that's the fraction of the machine that they're using. So could they come in and use one core and all the GPUs? Yes, they could. But we just didn't get the point of measuring it that way. You definitely could take output from your, you know, NVIDIA SMI command and understand And I think now, I mean, I know now in Slurm you have a lot more ease of doing that and tracking that. When we first did this model, you couldn't do that. So you could totally just do that as the metric that you're collecting. So any other questions? I will mention a few things that like we don't have in that formula. I never tried to take the network costs, whether you call that a facilities cost, like the actual your networking fee costs. Like what is your like 100 gig networking cost or your multiple 10 gig networking cost? I never put that into the HPC service because we don't monitor how that's being used for what service. So it's just a part. So like 25% of the costs are outside of the cost of the service. Like when we look at HPC and storage and VM, like 25% of the cost to just operate or outside of that. You know, that would be their staff time that go to the labs to like check on, you know, the instrument connectivity to our storage through the network that is also part of what is maintained by the department. So those things are not, you know, but we do have staff time, like on the networking side that run like the firewalls and all that, like split out over services. So we do recoup that part of it. Yeah. And you'll start to realize when you start to do this, if you start adding, when you saw those costs in the HPC, if you have a cost that is 10x the other costs, all the small costs really don't matter. You start getting like nickel and diamond on like little things and it doesn't even change your rate at all. So if it doesn't change your rate, then there's really no point in doing it from an exercise. So normally, so Tim kind of was thinking on the leasing part, I was talking about what the division of science does, not what the faculty do. So on the faculty side, which is the other portion of the cluster, they normally purchase things. They would, I don't know any faculty that actually lease gear, just to clarify that. And there's a fair amount of that that's not from grants, it's actually just from their startup. So in their startup packages, it would designate like you get this many cores added to the cluster on your behalf, and you have priority access on it. So that's where some of the cluster capacity comes from. And so, or you may have like a center that comes together and does this like for, you know, a group of faculty, like Center for Environment has done this where they like add like 12 faculties worth of startups up into a single large partition. Yeah, so I don't do anything on the cost. Vinod is asking about disk IO and network and all that. So in the HPC side, there's scratch file system. There is a quota that's given out per lab, you know, and that's just over time thinking about like what's reasonable, that's decent size. And then the scratch file system, 90 days until your file is removed, like if it's older than that. So we don't really measure IO and all that. The InfiniBand is a part of the HPC service and is extended across all the nodes, and so the cost of it is just a part of that acquisition of the HPC system. So it is in there. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know, Tim, I don't know if I would agree if that's where cloud shines. I think it is great. The cloud has everything under the sun that you can get to every fine-grained detail. But I also think that's kind of paralyzing sometimes in trying to make decisions or just try to do something quickly. You end up with like 1,000 decisions to make sometimes. So even if you were going to construct all of this in the cloud and create a recharge, I would caution people to like think about the parts of it that provide value to the researcher that are the most expensive parts and build that into your model, and everything else just say that's a part of the cost of doing business. Because if you take forever to measure everything and to try to build a cost model, you're going to drive your administrative cost up really high. And so you have to balance that. So no faculty wants to be paying for your service cost with some percentage of that going to administrative costs. They would much rather see the vast majority of that cost being the parts that they actually consume. So do we have, Jaime's asking about core facilities. Yes, there are core facilities in the sciences and in the medical school. There's, I think, 9 different core facilities in the sciences, various different microscopes, sequencing, and all of that. They are all academic service centers. They charge internal rates and external rates because there's people within the community. There is a target for the amount of income that they recover off their total. I don't know what it is. It's different for different ones. And then there is an informatics group, and it's part of the science operations core, like the informatics team and the science operations development team, that they are the ones who build the pipelines that take data from the instruments and push them onto the cluster. And they have their own partitions and storage on the cluster to do that. And then, so hopefully that answers. So they're just like, they're treated like a lab, right? Like that. So each of those cores is treated like a lab. They have their own resources. We aggregate their utilization that way. They can, and a lot of them have their own budget to add capacity because they need their own dedicated cores that they don't want to have to compete on the scheduler for. And so that's what a lot of the way in which they operate. I don't know if they've taken the computing cost and put it back into like the dollar per sequencing cost yet. They definitely could, but their computing also when they're done and they're done with their data, like somebody has to actually pick up the data and move it to like their faculty space. So it's not like they're responsible long-term for the data that's being generated. But I don't know yet if they like put that in the sequencing cost. But one could, if you wanted to. And then I missed the question that Jonathan, you had asked regarding faculty PI purchasing their own hardware. Is this on a rolling basis? Yeah, so that's one I think the hardest things about designing a system is that like the system within Faculty of Arts and Sciences, it's a 100,000 core system, and it's been that size for about a decade. So we've just taken off the stuff, and we had to create like stronger policies about like we only keep equipment while it's on warranty, and after 5 years, normally there's or maybe 6 years, there's no more warranty for it. And so then that stuff gets cycled out, and then new stuff is cycled in, and because they're not charged there's not charged a hosting fee, really, like for us to manage their servers and stuff. We feel like that's a pretty reasonable relationship to have. That's also was the driver to not do that with storage anymore. It has to be an exception through the dean's office that they would host storage outside of the storage service center. So the storage service center provides 4 different tiers. Tier 0 being like high performance file system like Lustre, no backup, just bulk, storage. Tier 1 is an enterprise class, so it's currently using Isilon, so it needed something that had like snapshots, DR, and a bunch of other features, like feature-rich tiered storage that one has. There's a tier 2, which is like Ceph, that provides like an NFS interface in front of it. That replaced a lot of the individual NFS boxes that may get rehauled. Like this is just what we started with. And then the tier 3 is like cold storage, like it's state. So we have the New England Storage Exchange project, and we have a whole tape apparatus there that is really just like cloud storage internally within MJHPC. So it's provided via like either S3 interface through MinIO, but predominantly through Globus. There's a Globus front end, and that's how people move things back and forth between it. So hopefully I answered that. Does that answer all your questions, Jonathan? So one of the things I will say, I guess, on Jonathan, your question. So whatever the department decides is the next deployment for HPC, that becomes the model that we stay with. And then we build like a little menu of like this machine twice as much memory, this machine with, you know, we just give a few options. Like there's this GPU option or this other one. So we give them a few different options, but we try to keep it pretty uniform, just from the management standpoint. And it also helps, the more you can keep the number of core count similar across the cluster, the easier it is to pack jobs in. At one point we had from 8 core machines to 64 core machines, and that was just, you ended up with a lot of open space. So, yeah.
Well, we're at our time limit, 12:59. I know people will ask if we can send out your slide deck. Is that something you share, Scott?
Yeah, I should be able to, I mean, I've given this publicly and you just recorded it, so I don't know why.
Well, that's
the slide deck would be any good.
yeah. Okay. Well, I will, because we'll send out a, you know, the link to the YouTube video. And then if you want to, if you can send that to me, I'll share that with the rest of the
I
community.
mean, and the numbers that I have in there in those spreadsheets, those are fictitious numbers. I'm just taking numbers that are reasonable in capacity and size relative to each other. They're not actually the actual numbers. So
And we have a lot of thanks for talking and I think we had our highest number of attendees today, even though this is an off day for us. So thanks again for coming, Scott. And you know, we may invite you back as part of a panel, like I said, next year, where we can, because we have a lot of people that have lots of different thoughts on all of this. So thanks
Yeah.
everyone for attending, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, whatever it is you celebrate, and hope everybody gets a good break.
Thank you.
thank you all.